The elevator doors closed on a 6-year-old's tear-streaked face, and for 3 long seconds, Daniel Reyes could not move. He stood in the marble lobby of a building he had helped bring to life, holding a cardboard box that contained the entire wreckage of his career, a janitor's badge, a faded photograph of a woman who was no longer alive to witness this humiliation, in a single crayon drawing his daughter had made for him that very morning before either of them knew this day would end in disgrace. Somewhere above him, 3 floors up, a door had just slammed shut on a decision that would prove before sunset to be the most catastrophic mistake of one man's career. Daniel did not argue when he was let go, did not raise his voice, did not beg, did not remind anyone of who he used to be. He simply nodded, wiped his daughter's tears with his thumb, and turned toward the exit, unaware that in less than 4 hours, the very company that had just discarded him would come apart at the seams, and that only one person left inside that building would know how to save it. What happened over the next few hours would change both of their lives forever. Before we begin, if you believe kindness, humility, and second chances can change the world, please take a moment to like this video. Comment where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs inspiration today, and subscribe to the Aura Fables for more unforgettable stories. 3 weeks earlier, on a gray Seattle morning heavy with drizzle and the smell of wet concrete, a black town car pulled up outside the glass tower of Halden Systems. And Preston Cole stepped out of it the way a king might step onto a battlefield he had already decided to win. He was 38 years old, dressed in a suit that cost more than most of his employees earned in a month. And he carried himself with the practiced, effortless arrogance of a man who had never once in his life been told no. Preston had taken over as CEO less than a year earlier, brought in by the board to modernize a company that, in his words, still smelled like a garage startup. He believed deeply, almost religiously in optics. To Preston, a company's worth could be read in the polish of its lobby floors, the cut of its employees' blazers, and the silence maintained by anyone he considered beneath his notice. He had built an entire career on charm, on knowing which investor to flatter and which meeting to walk into 10 minutes late, so that everyone else would be forced to wait for him. What Preston Cole had never built, not once, not with his own 2 hands, was anything of lasting value. Far beneath his glass office, past the humming server room and the loading dock where delivery trucks idled before dawn, worked a very different kind of man. His name was Daniel Reyes, and he moved through the building each night in gray coveralls and steel-toed boots, pushing a cleaning cart down hallways he had once walked as an equal among engineers. 6 years earlier, Daniel had been one of Halden Systems' founding architects, the man who wrote the earliest lines of code that the company's entire security platform still quietly depended on, back when Halden was nothing more than 3 exhausted engineers crammed into a rented office with a server that overheated every August. He had walked away from that world, from the 6-figure salary and the corner desk and the respect of his peers, the year his wife Maria was diagnosed with an illness so aggressive that it took her from him in less than a year. Their daughter Sophia was only 4 years old when she lost her mother, and Daniel made a promise at her bedside that he intended to keep for the rest of his life, that she would never again lose a parent to something as replaceable as a career. He took the janitorial position not because he had no other options, but because it let him work nights and be home every single evening, without exception, to make her breakfast, walk her to school, and tuck her in with the same 3 books she insisted on hearing on repeat. He never told a soul at Halden Systems who he used to be. He watched the company he had helped build swell into a name that investors whispered with reverence, watched strangers walk past him in the hallways without a glance, and he cleaned the floors of his own creation without a trace of bitterness, because he still believed quietly, stubbornly, that a person's dignity was not something any title, or the absence of one, could ever take from them. That particular Tuesday morning, Sophia's elementary school called before 8 o'clock. A pipe had burst overnight, flooding to classrooms, and school was canceled without warning. Daniel had no family nearby, no backup plan, and no one else he could call on such short notice. So he did the only thing a devoted father, in an impossible position, could do. He brought her with him, settled her quietly into the corner of the employee break room with a coloring book and a promise that he'd be done in just a few hours, and asked her, gently, to be as still and as quiet as she could manage. For hours she was. By 10 o'clock that morning, The 32nd floor of Halden Systems had transformed into a theater of barely restrained panic. In just 4 hours, the company's flagship product, a proprietary data security platform that had consumed 3 years and nearly $40 million of investor funding, was scheduled to be demonstrated live in front of a room of investors whose decisions would determine whether Halden Systems survived its next fiscal year or collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. And at precisely 9:47 that morning, during a routine final systems check, the platform had failed catastrophically, collapsing into a cascade of authentication errors that no engineer in the building could explain, let alone repair. Preston Cole stood at the center of the war room with his tie loosened and his voice climbing steadily toward something between fury and outright fear. Around him, a dozen of the highest-paid engineers in the Pacific Northwest stared helplessly at screens filled with error logs that meant nothing to any of them. Consultants who had been flown in from New York the night before, considerable expense, offered theory after theory, each one collapsing the moment someone attempted to test it. The platform's earliest architecture, they kept repeating with growing frustration, contained undocumented segments, elegant, unconventional shortcuts written by whoever had built the very first version of the system. Shortcuts that not a single person currently employed at Halden fully understood, because the man who wrote them was long gone. "We built our entire Series C valuation on this single demonstration," Preston said, his voice cracking with a tightness he rarely allowed anyone to see. "If this platform fails in front of our investors this afternoon, there will be no second round of funding. There will be no second chance." "Do any of you understand what is at stake here?" No one answered him. The room was full of brilliant, expensively educated people, and not one of them had the faintest idea what to do. It was in this exact moment, this precise, unraveling collapse of a company's entire future, that Daniel Reyes happened to walk past the war room's open glass doors, pushing his cleaning cart toward the recycling bins 1 floor up, completing what he believed to be his final task before being formally dismissed for the unforgivable offense of loving his daughter too visibly, too publicly, in a building that valued polish over people. He glanced, purely out of old habit, at the error logs projected across the massive wall screen, and he stopped walking entirely. He recognized the code instantly. He had written it, line by line, 6 years earlier, in a rented office that no longer existed. "Excuse me," Daniel said quietly, standing in the doorway in his gray coveralls, his voice barely rising above the chaos of the room. A few heads turned briefly in irritation. Preston did not even look up. "This is not the time," he snapped, dismissing the man at the door as nothing more than an unwelcome distraction, unworthy of a second glance. "The failure is in the authentication handshake," Daniel said, stepping further into the room anyway, his voice steady and unhurried, the voice of a man who had once delivered far more difficult truths in far higher stakes rooms than this one. "Third recursive call. That function was never meant to run in parallel with the encryption layer. I built a safeguard specifically to prevent that exact conflict, but it looks like someone stripped it out during a refactor at some point, without ever understanding why it was there in the first place." The room fell utterly silent. "And who exactly are you?" one of the New York consultants asked, half laughing, as though the question alone answered itself. "My name is Daniel Reyes," he said simply. "I wrote the original authentication architecture for this platform, back when this company was 3 people and 1 overheating server in a rented office on 3rd Avenue. I left 6 years ago to raise my daughter alone after my wife passed away." A junior engineer near the back of the room, pale and visibly shaking, pulled up the platform's earliest commit history with trembling hands. The name attached to the very first lines of code matched perfectly. Daniel Reyes, founding architect. Preston Cole's face drained of every trace of color. Daniel did not gloat, and he did not raise his voice, simply asked politely for an open terminal. Sat down at the nearest workstation, still dressed in his cleaning uniform, and began to type, his weathered hands moving across the keyboard with the fluent, unhesitating certainty of a man returning, after a long and painful exile, to a language he had never truly forgotten how to speak. 11 minutes later, the system passed every single check without error. The room did not erupt into celebration immediately. Instead, it sat in a silence so complete it felt almost sacred, the silence of dozens of highly credentialed. deeply accomplished people confronting all at once. The staggering scale of how badly they had misjudged a man simply because of what he had been wearing that morning. Then, someone quietly brought Sophia in from the break room down the hall. Tears still drying on her small cheeks from having watched her father be escorted out of the building only hours before. She stood frozen in the doorway and saw him there, seated at the center of the room. As engineers and executives, and the very same consultants who had dismissed him without a second thought, rose to their feet. One by one, in a spontaneous, thunderous, standing ovation. Sophia's small hands flew up to cover her mouth, and she began to cry once more, but this time for an entirely different reason. Preston Cole crossed the room himself, extending a hand toward Daniel, along with an apology that was, for perhaps the first time in his entire career, completely unrehearsed and genuinely felt. It marked the beginning of a change in him that would outlast that single extraordinary afternoon, a permanent, humbling unlearning of the belief that a person's worth could ever be measured by the clothes they wore or the title printed on their badge. In the months that followed, Daniel Reyes returned to Halden Systems, but not as a janitor. He returned as the company's new chief architect, offered the office, the title, and the salary he had walked away from 6 years earlier. But before he accepted, he made one condition, and one condition only, that Halden Systems establish a permanent fund guaranteeing tuition assistance and emergency childcare support for every hourly employee in the building raising children alone, just as he once had, quietly and without complaint, for years. Sophia grew up knowing her father not as the man who had once been fired in a moment of casual cruelty, but as the man who stood quietly in a room full of powerful people who had underestimated him completely, and let his knowledge, his patience, and his character speak in a language far louder than any title ever could. True greatness, after all, is never measured by the size of an office or the polish of a suit. It is measured always by character, by who a person chooses to become when no one is watching, and by the invisible battles every single one of us carries quietly beneath the surface of an ordinary day.